What if the great housing solution was actually a myth? What if no matter how much we build, homes will keep getting further and further out of reach? What if this wasn't just a supply problem, but rather a global system failure? I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. You know how everyone has moments in their lives that they'll never forget? Well, for me, it's when my best friend ran out of the room screaming, "It's a boy." He never went back to Thailand again. And you'll never want to leave my content once you've enjoyed some of that try-hard Greek Adonis stimulating stuff. So please like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'm here to provide analysis and commentary on the big stuff that affects your life. Now today we're considering if the housing crisis is a global phenomenon that can't be stopped. And to do that, we're going to check out this video from Gary's Economics titled "The Real Reason Behind the Housing Crisis."
Today, we are going to explain one of the biggest and most misunderstood economic questions of our time.
Why are Sydney dog boxes the most expensive real estate in the world?
Why is housing so expensive? Okay, so this is obviously pretty much the biggest economic question everybody wants to know. So I want to explain why the way that you think about housing and the way that you think about the expensiveness of housing is wrong.
Now, I certainly don't agree with everything said by Gary's Economics, but he does seem to have a great knowledge of global economic systems and he's able to explain it quite well. And that must be why he's got 1.5 million bloody subscribers. But I'll still say exactly what I think because my subscribers are bloody beautiful. You know, like King Leonidas in the movie 300, we may not all look like a chiseled Spartan, but inside, we're fierce, baby. Fierce.
Okay, so the first thing you need to understand about the expensiveness of housing is that it is a global issue. People seem to think that it is something that is happening specifically in their city.
I definitely agree it's a global issue. I've seen heaps of posts lately saying how US housing market has become so much less affordable. And for me, I look over at US house prices and in general, they're way bloody better than here in Australia. So yes, in countries like Australia, Canada, UK, New Zealand, house prices have surged and housing affordability has deteriorated, but it's not completely even across the board. Australia, in my opinion, takes the cake for having one of the most speculative, FOMO-driven, ridiculous housing markets in the entire world.
Once you step back and get a bit of distance, this is quite obviously a global problem which must therefore have a global cause.
Or even scarier, an orchestrated global plan designed to make housing unaffordable for the vast majority of citizens, thus forcing them to rent and be wholly dependent on government support. Remember the World Economic Forum's 2030 goal stating that you'll own nothing and be extremely bloody unhappy? Oh, sorry, I meant happy.
The next thing that I'm going to explain, and I think this really helps us to understand what is going on here, is it's not happening just in houses. Basically, every stock market in the entire world is at an all-time high.
Are you saying that we might have an everything bubble where all asset classes seem to rise at the same time? And not only rise, they continue rising, creating new all-time highs pretty much every single quarter? Is that what you're telling me?
At the beginning of COVID, and I've spoken about this a few times on the channel, I realized very quickly that the rich would accumulate a lot of money. And I knew for like relatively obvious reasons that was going to push asset prices up because rich people, when given money, tend to spend almost all of it on assets. So I went and put a massive bet on the gold price going up.
So why have the rich been getting exponentially richer? Well, the M2 money supply chart gives us a great clue. This chart measures how much money is floating around in the economy. And here we have the money supply of the US. As you can see, money supply was growing fairly modestly prior to 2000. But then after 2000, it really started to ramp up. But shockingly, look what happened after 2020 when COVID hit. Money supply basically went straight up as massive amounts of stimulus was poured into the economy. We then saw a little dip followed by increase again to brand new all-time highs. So when there's more money in the system, inflation tends to rise, leading to higher day-to-day living costs. But also assets tend to rise. So those owning hard assets like real estate, stocks or gold tend to do well in this environment.
It's happening in basically every asset. What you have seen in the short term, the medium term and the long term now is just a massive increase in the price of basically all assets when compared to things like wages.
And this is the massive issue with house prices going up exponentially. Because house prices have been rising faster than wages ever since the year 2000, basically every single year becomes harder and harder for a first home buyer to buy their own home. And when everyday living costs grow faster than wages, it's like a double bloody whammy. You've got higher living expenses, which makes it harder to save, meaning unless you have help from your parents, it's extremely difficult to get into the market.
The rich accumulated a ton of money during COVID, but that is just a continuation of a pre-existing trend, which was the rich are getting richer and richer and richer and richer. As they accumulate larger and larger and larger ownership of wealth, that generates for them more and more and more passive income, and there's basically nothing they can do with that passive income other than to buy the rest of the wealth.
Now, Gary talks about the rich getting richer all the time. And inflationary environments certainly can turbocharge wealth creation. But one reason I see why this wealth gap keeps getting larger and larger is due to governments propping up their economies with stimulus and bailouts, thus preventing normal corrections and crashes, which helps reset markets. It seems like today, any sign of financial instability or weakness, governments will come in with some stimulatory measure because they always want to see their economies growing. But in previous years, when there was a large crash, say in the stock market, that would create opportunities for wealth transfers, as those who were previously rich on many occasions would crash and burn, especially if they had loans or leverage, and newbies were able to enter the market at lower prices. But lately, all we've had is the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, which saw stock markets crash, real estate crash in many countries like the US. But in Australia, where housing demand is through the freaking roof, house prices hardly fell and then resumed their upwards trend. But COVID's a perfect example. Instead of being fiscally responsible, governments locked people down and flooded their economies with so much stimulus, combined with central banks reducing their interest rates to zero, which turned a potential crash in asset prices into a full-blown speculative buying spree, which is still going on 5 years bloody later.
People often look at the current level of unaffordability of housing and they look at graphs such as house price versus average wage. And they see that in the last 10, 20, 30 years, the average house price in the UK, for example, has become extremely expensive relative to wages compared to what it was 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago.
Of course we look at that because that's what our parents and grandparents enjoyed. Before the year 2000, a family with one income earner just on the average wage could easily afford to buy a home and pay it off relatively quickly. In the 2000s, you needed 2 average incomes, but today you basically need 2 abnormally high incomes just to be able to afford the average home. If you've got something really good, like affordable housing, you bloody well fight to keep it as long as you can.
And they often then say, oh, well, that means housing now is unsustainably expensive. It is unaffordable for ordinary people and house prices will have to come down. The historic outlier is actually not now when housing is very unaffordable. The historic outlier is that period after the Second World War when housing was affordable. If you read about the history of the UK or Europe, if you read your Dickens, you will see that for most of history, housing was not affordable. And that was because for most of history, we had very high levels of inequality.
This is right. Throughout history, you had the upper class or the lord, and then you had the poor, the slaves or the peasants. But in democratic capitalistic societies, the average citizen is given opportunities to be innovative, take risks, start businesses, invest and create wealth for themselves. And that allows the formation of a middle class where many people in a country are self-sufficient financially. So the question is, are we hurtling back to the feudal era of lords and peasants? And if we are, I can pretty much guarantee that none of us are going to be in that lord class. Or today, it might be described as the elites.
We had this dip in inequality in the post-war period, And what that literally means is that dip in wealth inequality means assets being owned by ordinary people. Now we've moved towards a much more unequal society. The rich are much richer, ordinary people are much poorer. What that means is you are increasingly competing with billionaires and multimillionaires with enormous amounts of passive income for ownership of the houses, and you can't compete with them. And housing will continue to get more and more unaffordable as long as inequality increases, which it is doing, and which it will continue to do.
That's a very ominous prediction by Gary, but I do agree that things just look to keep getting worse. Fiscal responsibility seems to be getting worse as global debt starts to skyrocket. Overall control over freedoms and liberties seems to be getting worse. Remember that thing in 2020? And then there's increased taxes around every corner, plus talk of countries raising the pension age because they don't have enough money. So unless things turn around quickly, thriving financially could be a thing of the past.
So what does that mean about the kind of commonly given stories about housing? The biggest one in this country is definitely just build more, just build more, just build more. This idea that housing is expensive, you should just build more houses.
The worst one in Australia is just build more, but then run mass migration levels at the same time. The goal to build more fails, but the huge increase in net migration puts added demand under house prices, sending them surging year after year.
If you exist in a world where all asset prices are increasing aggressively quickly, and that is what is driving house prices, how many houses do you think you need to build here in London to stop or reverse a global massive increase in the cost of all assets? You know, it's not possible, you know.
The thing that Gary doesn't talk much about is actual demand for housing. I acknowledge when demand outstrips supply, prices go up. But in places around the world where you have a huge supply of housing but not much demand, that helps to keep house prices much more affordable. If you look at China and Hong Kong, they had some of the most expensive housing in the world, but recently they've had more supply than demand and houses have become more affordable. It's definitely happened in New Zealand and more recently in Canada. And it's especially the case in Japan in some of those regional areas where there's millions of empty houses.
So, in answer to our opening question, why is housing expensive? It's because the rich are buying it all and you can't compete with them. The way to deal with that is to tax the rich more, to tax working people less. That is why we campaign here to tax wealth, not work.
I'd like to propose that the real reason that house prices and assets are going up is because currencies are being debased, which means their value is being weakened. When money is printed or created, there's more money floating around in the system, so each dollar becomes worth less. When people realize that their dollar is losing value, they all rush to try to buy assets to protect the value of their wealth. But that's why not only house prices have been increasing lately, stock markets have been increasing, crypto's been going through the roof, apart from the recent sell down, gold and silver, etc. And in countries where real estate has provided the best return based on how much you can leverage, like Australia, demand just ends up going through the roof. So you could say house prices are going up in price, or on the other hand, you could say that money is going down in value. And because governments seem to be addicted to printing money, as well as propping up the market at the first sign of trouble, sadly, this crisis might just keep getting worse. I'm Biko Konstantinos.